Emily Walker adjusted her scarf as she stepped out of her apartment into the crisp autumn air of Willowbrook, Pennsylvania. The small town was picturesque, with its tree-lined streets and old-fashioned charm. But for Emily, it had always felt suffocating. Here, tradition was everything, and reputation meant more than happiness. She had spent her entire life under the watchful eyes of her mother, Margaret, a well-respected figure in the local church community. Margaret believed in structure, in appearances, in the importance of a well-mannered, well-married daughter. Emily, however, had never fit that mold. "Emily, hurry up, we're going to be late for church," Margaret called from inside their stately home, her tone clipped and impatient. Emily sighed, tightening her grip on her handbag. She had spent years conforming, following the rigid expectations set upon her. But she had always longed for something more, something beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook. At breakfast, her father, Charles, a retired bank manager with a stern demeanor, was already seated at the table, sipping coffee and flipping through the newspaper. "Ashley called," Margaret announced, pouring tea into a delicate china cup. "Martin just got promoted to senior partner at his firm. Isn't that wonderful?" Ashley, Emily's older sister, had always been the golden child. She had done everything right, married a successful lawyer, settled in a beautiful home, and presented their parents with the picture-perfect life they had always wanted. "That's great," Emily replied, forcing a polite smile. She had grown used to Ashley's achievements overshadowing anything she did. Margaret turned to her with the same disapproving glance she had perfected over the years. "You need to think about settling down. Emily, you're already 29. A woman can't afford to wait forever." Emily clenched her jaw. She had heard this speech 1,000 times before. In Willowbrook, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to find a husband and start a family. But Emily wasn't interested in marriage for the sake of appearances. She had dreams, ones that didn't include a white picket fence and a husband chosen by her parents. She escaped to her job at the Willowbrook Art Museum, where she worked as an art restoration specialist. It was the one place she felt truly herself, breathing life back into faded paintings and forgotten relics. It was there, in that quiet sanctuary, that she first met Miles Carter. He had appeared one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the restoration room, his hands tucked into the pockets of a well-worn navy sweater. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep but warm. "I was hoping to watch the restoration process. I spoke with Jessica, the director, and she said it would be okay." Emily hesitated. Visitors weren't usually allowed in. But there was something about him, an air of curiosity, a quiet confidence, that made her nod. "I'm restoring an 18th-century miniature portrait," she explained, motioning him over. He studied the delicate strokes of the brush in her hand. "Rococo style," he observed, known for its intricate detailing and soft colors. Emily looked at him in surprise. "You know art history?" "Just a hobby," he admitted with a modest smile. "I'm particularly fascinated by portraits from the 17th to 19th centuries." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and over the next few weeks, Miles became a regular presence in her life. He was different from anyone she had ever met, thoughtful, intelligent, and most importantly, he saw her, not as an obligation, not as a disappointment, but as someone worth knowing. One evening, as they sat in a quiet cafe, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You have a gift, Emily. The way you bring life back to forgotten things, it's incredible." She had never heard words like that before. Not from anyone who mattered. Her heart fluttered, but at the same time, an unease settled in her chest. It felt too good to be true. Then, one day, without warning, Miles disappeared. His phone was disconnected. His address, one he had given her, suddenly belonged to someone else. It was as if he had never existed. Emily searched for him, but every lead came to a dead end. Had she been a fool? Had she imagined the connection they shared? The answer came weeks later, in the form of a pregnancy test. Sitting in the dim light of her small apartment bathroom, Emily stared at the 2 pink lines on the stick in her trembling hands. The world tilted beneath her. She was pregnant, and she was alone. Her mind raced. How could she tell her parents? She could already hear Margaret's voice dripping with disappointment. "You've disgraced this family, Emily. What will people think?" But no amount of fear or shame could change what was real. There was a life growing inside her. And she would fight for it. She straightened her back and wiped the tears from her eyes. Tomorrow, she would tell them. Tomorrow, she would face their judgment. But deep down, she already knew what they would say. She would no longer be Emily Walker, the woman with potential. She would be Emily Walker, the disgrace. And there would be no turning back. Emily Walker stood outside her parents' grand home in Willowbrook, Pennsylvania, gripping the doorknob so tightly her knuckles turned white. The familiar scent of freshly baked bread and cinnamon drifted through the cracks of the door, a deceptive warmth that didn't match the cold dread settling in her chest. She knew this conversation would change everything. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The living room was pristine. As always, her mother Margaret's obsession with order evident in the perfectly placed cushions and the polished wooden floors. Seated on the couch, her father, Charles, glanced up from his newspaper. His expression unreadable. Her sister, Ashley, was there too, perched elegantly in her designer coat, her golden hair framing her smug, picture-perfect smile. "Emily, you're late," Margaret scolded, standing with a porcelain teacup in her hands. "You know we don't like to wait." Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I need to tell you something." Margaret let out a long-suffering sigh, setting her cup down with an audible clink. "If this is another excuse about why you're still single, I'm pregnant." The words landed like a grenade. The room fell into silence, thick and suffocating. Ashley's perfectly arched brows shot up. But it was her father who spoke first. "What?" His voice was dangerously quiet. But Emily could hear the thunder beneath it. Margaret's face paled, her fingers tightening around the edge of the dining table. "You're joking." "I'm not," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Her father set his newspaper down carefully, his lips pressing into a thin, unforgiving line. "And the father?" Emily swallowed hard. "His name is Miles." Ashley let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Miles? You mean that nobody you were seeing a few months ago? The one who vanished?" Emily flinched. The words cut deep because they were true. She had searched for Miles, called him, even gone to the address he had given her, only to find a stranger living there. It was as if he had never existed. "I don't know where he is," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. "But that doesn't change anything. I'm keeping my baby." Margaret gasped, placing a hand on her chest as if Emily had just told her she had committed a crime. "You can't be serious," she breathed. "You expect to raise a child alone? You expect us to accept this disgrace?" Charles's voice was sharp, filled with quiet fury. "A single mother in this family? Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation?" Emily felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, suffocating her. But then she looked down at her stomach, at the life growing inside her, and something inside her hardened. "I don't care about your reputation," she said, her voice stronger now. "This is my child, and I will raise him with or without your approval." Margaret let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You ungrateful girl," she spat. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By bringing shame to our family?" Emily clenched her fists. "Everything you've done for me? You've spent my whole life comparing me to Ashley, treating me like a disappointment because I didn't marry a lawyer or have a perfect little family like she did. But I'm done trying to earn your approval." Ashley crossed her arms. "You should listen to Mom and Dad. Emily, you don't have what it takes to do this alone." Emily turned to her father, hoping for something, even the smallest sign that he still saw her as his daughter. But his face was stone, cold and unmoving. "You're not our daughter anymore." The words knocked the air from her lungs. Charles stood, adjusting his tie as though they were discussing business, not throwing their own flesh and blood away. "Pack your things. Get out of this house." Margaret nodded, her lips pursed. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer part of this family." Emily's heart pounded. The little girl inside her, the one who had spent her whole life craving their love, begged her to apologize, to fix this somehow. But the woman she had become, the mother she was going to be, knew the truth. There was nothing left to fix. Without another word, she turned and walked upstairs to her childhood room. She moved mechanically, stuffing clothes into a suitcase, grabbing her most important belongings. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a small framed photo of herself as a child. Sitting on her father's shoulders, laughing. That little girl was gone. 30 minutes later, she stood at the front door, suitcase in hand, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned back one last time, hoping, praying that one of them would say something. But her mother wouldn't meet her gaze. Her father had already turned away. Ashley examined her nails, looking bored. With a deep breath, Emily stepped outside into the cold evening air. As she pulled her coat tighter around herself, she felt the first stirrings of her baby move inside her. And in that moment, despite the pain, the heartbreak, and the uncertainty ahead, Emily felt something else. Too. Freedom. She took a step forward. Then another. She wasn't walking away from family. She was walking toward a future where she and her child would never feel unwanted again. Emily Walker stood outside the grand white pillars of her parents' estate in Willowbrook, Pennsylvania. The air was crisp, the late autumn chill creeping through her thin coat. But it was nothing compared to the ice settling in her chest. She took a deep breath, willing herself to step forward, to finally face them. As she walked up the steps and knocked, she could already hear the familiar hum of conversation from inside. The sound of expensive china clinking, her mother's delicate laughter, and the deep timbre of her father's voice. The door swung open. Her mother, Margaret, stood in the doorway, perfectly polished as always, hair styled, pearl necklace resting just above her crisp white sweater. But the moment she saw Emily, her expression faltered. "What are you doing here?" Margaret asked, her voice cold. Emily's stomach twisted, but she steadied herself. "I need to talk to you and Dad." Margaret pursed her lips but stepped aside, letting her in. As Emily entered the living room, her father, Charles, lowered his newspaper. Across from him, her sister, Ashley, sat with her legs elegantly crossed, sipping tea. She looked up and smirked, as if already amused by whatever failure Emily was about to confess. Her father set his paper down, fixing her with a steely gaze. This better be important. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. "I'm pregnant." Silence crashed over the room. Ashley nearly choked on her tea. Margaret went rigid, her fingers clenching the edge of the tablecloth. Charles's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Then, Margaret let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You must be joking." Emily shook her head. "I'm not." Her father's voice was low and controlled, but there was an edge of fury beneath it. "Who is the father?" Emily hesitated. "His name is Miles." "But..." Ashley cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Oh, this just keeps getting better. The same Miles who vanished months ago?" Emily's chest tightened. "I don't know where he is," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's hand flew to her chest in horror. "So, you're telling us that not only are you pregnant, but you've been abandoned?" "I wasn't abandoned," Emily snapped, though even she wasn't sure if it was true. Something must have happened to him. Charles let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Enough. We need to be practical about this." He turned to Margaret. "We can arrange for her to stay out of sight until this is handled." Emily froze. Handled? Her mother finally looked her in the eye, her cold blue gaze sharp as a knife. "You will not keep this baby." Emily felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. "What?" "You have two choices," Margaret continued, her voice eerily calm. "You can either terminate the pregnancy, or we will arrange for an adoption." "But keeping the child? Raising it on your own?" She let out a dry laugh. "That's simply out of the question." Emily's hands curled into fists. "This isn't your decision." Charles's expression darkened. "It is when it affects this family's reputation." Ashley smirked from her place on the couch, lazily twirling her hair. "Honestly, Emily, do you really think you can raise a baby alone? You barely take care of yourself." Emily's nails dug into her palms. "I can do this. I will do this." Margaret scoffed. "Don't be selfish." Selfish. The word rang in her ears. Was it selfish to want to love her own child? To want to build a life, even if it wasn't the one they had envisioned for her? Emily took a deep breath, standing taller. "I don't need your approval," she said quietly, "and I won't ask for it." A heavy silence filled the room. Then, Charles spoke, his voice like ice. "If you walk out of this house with that mindset, you walk out for good." Emily's breath hitched. Her father's expression was unreadable. But there was no hesitation in his words. He meant it. Ashley sighed dramatically, setting her tea down. Guess you're finally getting what you always wanted. Huh, Em? A chance to be independent. Emily turned to her mother, hoping, praying, for some sign of hesitation. But Margaret simply picked up her cup and took a sip, dismissing her as if she were a stranger. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, Emily considered staying, giving in, apologizing, promising to be the daughter they wanted if it meant not losing them forever. But then she thought of her baby. This child, her child, deserved better than a family that saw them as an inconvenience. Emily squared her shoulders and turned toward the door. Goodbye. No one stopped her. The moment she stepped outside, the cold air stung her skin. But she didn't look back. As she reached the end of the driveway, a sudden gust of wind sent golden leaves swirling around her. She had nothing. No home. No family. No support. And yet, as she placed a hand over her stomach, feeling the faintest flutter of movement, she knew she had everything she needed. She wasn't walking away from a family. She was walking toward one. Emily Walker stood outside the towering, ivy-clad mansion she once called home. The cold air bit at her skin. But she barely noticed. She had been standing there for nearly 5 minutes, her heart pounding against her ribs, hands trembling at her sides. She wasn't sure if it was the bitter wind making her shiver, or the weight of what she was about to do. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing every word in her head, imagining every possible reaction from her family. But now, standing in front of the grand wooden doors, all of that preparation felt meaningless. This wasn't a conversation. It was a battle. Steeling herself, she raised a trembling fist and knocked. The sound echoed through the house. And for a moment, everything was silent. Then, footsteps approached. The door swung open, revealing Margaret Walker, her mother, dressed immaculately. As always, blonde hair pinned in a flawless bun, pearl earrings gleaming against her pressed cream blouse. But when her sharp blue eyes landed on Emily, her carefully crafted expression froze. Emily, Margaret said stiffly, her tone as cold as the December air. Why are you here? Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. I need to talk to you. To Dad. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. They're in the sitting room. Emily stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. The smell of freshly brewed tea and old books filled her senses, dragging her back into a world she no longer belonged to. She walked down the familiar hallway, past framed family portraits where she stood slightly apart from her sister. Ashley, the golden child. Even in photos, it was clear who had been the favorite. Entering the sitting room, she found her father, Charles Walker, seated in his usual chair by the fireplace, reading the newspaper. Across from him sat Ashley, sipping from a delicate china teacup. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the porcelain as she glanced up, immediately smirking when she saw Emily. Oh, Ashley said, raising an eyebrow. Look who finally decided to show her face. Charles lowered his newspaper and looked at Emily over the rim of his glasses. His expression was unreadable. This must be important if you've come all this way. Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I'm pregnant. Silence. A long, thick silence that felt like it stretched for eternity. Margaret, who had just walked into the room, let out a small gasp. Ashley nearly choked on her tea. Then, her father spoke. His voice was slow, measured, dangerous. Excuse me? Emily gripped the fabric of her coat. I said, I heard what you said. Charles interrupted, his voice like ice. He set his newspaper down, folding it with practiced precision. What I don't understand is how you could stand there and say it. Ashley let out a short laugh. Oh, this is priceless. Margaret, however, wasn't amused. Who is the father? She demanded. Emily hesitated, and that slight pause was enough. Oh my God. Ashley practically beamed in delight. You don't even know. Emily's stomach twisted. That's not true. Then where is he? Margaret's voice was sharp. Why isn't he here with you? Emily's throat tightened. His name is Miles. He had to leave town. Something happened. Charles exhaled, shaking his head. So, not only did you get yourself into this situation, but you did it with a man who vanished the moment responsibility came knocking? That's not what happened, Emily snapped. Margaret let out a humorless laugh. You have no idea how humiliating this is. Emily flinched. Humiliating? Yes. Margaret spat. Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation? Do you know how people will talk? Ashley smirked. Oh, they'll talk. All right. Poor, foolish Emily, always a disappointment. And now? A scandal. Emily's pulse roared in her ears. You care more about what people will think than about your own grandchild? Charles stood, the finality of the movement making her stomach drop. Emily, listen carefully. He walked to the fireplace, placing a hand on the mantel. We will not allow this disgrace to ruin everything we've built. Emily's blood turned to ice. What are you saying? Margaret straightened, folding her arms. You have two choices. Either you terminate the pregnancy, or you give the baby up for adoption. Ashley sipped her tea, grinning. We might even find a decent couple who'd be willing to take it. Emily felt something inside her snap. Her hands curled into fists, her breath trembling as she looked between them. Charles exhaled. He met her gaze, his eyes hard. You walk out that door and don't bother coming back. The room felt like it was spinning. They were really doing this. They were really throwing her away. For a brief, agonizing moment, Emily felt a flash of weakness, a desperate urge to beg, to plead, to make them see her, to make them care. But then she felt it. A small flutter in her stomach. The faintest movement of life. And suddenly, everything was clear. Emily slowly straightened, lifting her chin. Fine. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I said fine. Emily turned, heading for the door. Her mother's voice followed her. If you walk out that door, don't expect to come crawling back. Emily paused at the threshold, gripping the handle. Then, without looking back, she whispered, I won't need to. She stepped out into the cold, slamming the door shut behind her. She was alone, disowned, unwanted. But as she placed a hand over her stomach, she realized something powerful. She wasn't leaving a family. She was creating one. Emily Walker stood outside her parents' grand suburban home, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was crisp, biting at her cheeks, but the cold was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside her. It had been 8 months since she was last here, since they had thrown her out like she was nothing. And yet, despite the pain they had caused, here she was, standing at their doorstep with Miles by her side and their baby in her arms. She hadn't wanted to come. Every step toward this house felt like walking into a battlefield where she knew the enemy was waiting. But Miles had insisted. You deserve closure, Emily. You need to show them that you didn't break. He was right. She took a breath, steeling herself, and knocked. The door swung open almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting. Her mother, Margaret Walker, stood there, her sharp blue eyes widening in shock. Her blonde hair was still pinned perfectly, her pearl necklace in place, every bit the proper, respectable woman she had always been. Emily, Margaret whispered. Her gaze flickered down to the baby in Emily's arms. A deep wrinkle of disapproval formed between her brows. Behind her, her father, Charles, entered the hallway, his face hard as stone. He didn't say a word. Ashley, her perfect older sister, appeared next, dressed elegantly, eyes narrowing like a predator who had just spotted its prey. A suffocating silence stretched between them. Emily swallowed, gripping Noah closer to her chest. Can we come in? Margaret hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, before stepping aside. The air inside was thick, tense, hostile. Emily walked into the familiar living room, its decor untouched, as if her presence had never existed in this house. Her heart clenched as she sat down. Miles stayed beside her, his protective presence the only thing keeping her from unraveling. Margaret and Charles sat across from them, Ashley gracefully perching on the armrest of the couch. Margaret's voice was cool, distant. You have a child. Emily nodded. His name is Noah. Silence. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. I suppose you expect us to be happy about this. Emily's grip on Noah tightened. I don't expect anything, but I thought you should meet him. He's your grandson. Margaret scoffed, shaking her head. A bastard born out of wedlock, ruining our family's name. That's what he is. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in Miles' throat. Emily grabbed his hand, silently telling him to hold back. Charles exhaled deeply, his expression unreadable. You made your choice, Emily. You left. Why come back now? Emily's jaw clenched. Because I wanted to give you a chance. A chance to be part of his life. Ashley laughed, sipping her tea. How noble of you, she sneered, trying to pretend like you're some selfless martyr. Emily felt her hands shake. But she refused to let them see her break. I don't expect anything from you, Emily said, her voice steady despite the rage bubbling inside her. But one day, when Noah asks why his grandparents were never there, I want to be able to tell him that I tried. Margaret rolled her eyes. You expect us to welcome you back after what you did? After humiliating this family? Emily's breath hitched. What I did, she whispered. Margaret's glare sharpened. You shamed us. You became the town's scandal. We had to make excuses for you. Tell people you went on some spiritual retreat to hide the truth. Ashley smirked. Mom had to come up with something. Otherwise, everyone would know what a disappointment you are. Emily felt something inside her snap. Enough. She stood abruptly, startling them. You know what? I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd want to meet Noah. But I see now that I was a fool to expect anything different from you. Margaret scoffed. Where do you think you're going? Emily turned to her mother, eyes blazing. Anywhere but here. She shifted Noah in her arms. Ready to leave. Miles stood too, his stance protective, as if daring them to stop her. Margaret's voice turned sickly sweet. Emily, dear, don't be dramatic. We're family. You'll always be our daughter. Emily spun back around, fury flashing in her eyes. You threw me out. You told me I was a disgrace. You called my child a mistake. Margaret's face twisted with irritation, like she was annoyed that Emily was still speaking. Emily took a deep breath, staring at them for the last time. You know what's funny? I actually felt guilty for leaving. I thought I was losing my family. She glanced at Noah, then at Miles. But I see now, I wasn't losing a family. I was escaping a prison. Margaret's face turned red with anger. Charles stiffened. Even Ashley's smirk faltered. Emily turned on her heel and marched toward the door. Miles followed without hesitation. Just as she reached for the doorknob, Margaret spoke again, her voice suddenly soft, almost desperate. Emily, wait. Emily hesitated for half a second. Then, with a sharp exhale, she opened the door and stepped outside. Margaret's voice called after her again. But Emily didn't look back. She walked to the car, head high, heart steady. As she settled Noah into his seat, Miles gently took her hand. Are you okay? Emily exhaled. Then, for the first time in a long time, she smiled. I am now. She slid into the passenger seat. Never looking back. She had finally chosen herself. Emily Walker's heart pounded as she stood outside her parents' grand colonial home. Her baby nestled in her arms. Snowflakes drifted down, settling on her coat, but she barely felt the cold. It had been 8 months since they had thrown her out, 8 months since they had turned their backs on her. And now, standing at their doorstep again, she wondered why she had even come. Are you sure about this? Miles' deep voice broke through her thoughts. He stood beside her, his presence steady and strong. The man who had once disappeared was now here, holding her hand, ready to face the family that had cast her aside. Emily let out a shaky breath and nodded. I need to do this. Before she could change her mind, she reached out and knocked. The door opened almost instantly. Margaret Walker stood there, perfectly dressed, her icy blue eyes widening in shock. Behind her, Emily could see her father, Charles, stiff and unreadable, and her older sister, Ashley, perched elegantly on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, Margaret's gaze dropped to the baby in Emily's arms. Her lips thinned. So, it's true. Emily lifted her chin. His name is Noah. Margaret let out a sigh of irritation but stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. The air inside was suffocating. The warmth of the fireplace did nothing to thaw the tension that filled the room. Emily sat down, Noah cradled against her chest, while Miles remained standing beside her. Her father cleared his throat. Why are you here, Emily? Emily met his gaze head on. I wanted you to meet your grandson. Margaret scoffed. A bastard child? You expect us to pretend this is normal? Emily's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to remain calm. Mom, he's a baby. Your grandson. He deserves to know his family. Ashley let out a low, mocking laugh. How noble of you. Bringing your charity case to beg for forgiveness? Miles' hands clenched into fists. But Emily placed a gentle hand on his arm, silently asking him to hold back. I'm not here to beg, she said, her voice steady. I just wanted to give you the chance to know him. Margaret crossed her arms. Well, we don't want to. Emily flinched at the harshness in her mother's voice. Even after everything, she had held on to some small hope that her parents would soften, that they would want to know their grandson. But she had been wrong. Her father sighed heavily. Emily, you chose this. You chose to disgrace this family. Emily's chest tightened. I chose to have my child. To raise him, even when you abandoned me. Margaret rolled her eyes. Oh, spare us the theatrics. You think we don't know why you're really here? Emily frowned. What are you talking about? Margaret gave her a pointed look. You married a billionaire. Emily, do you really think we're stupid? You didn't come back for family. You came back because you want something. Emily's blood ran cold. I didn't. Margaret cut her off. We heard the news. Miles Foster, CEO of Foster International. She let out a slow, calculating smirk. And suddenly, you want to reconnect. How convenient. Emily shot to her feet, rage burning through her. You think I came here for money? She hissed. I came here because I thought, for one stupid moment, that maybe, just maybe, you would care. Margaret's smirk faded. I was wrong, Emily whispered. I should have known better. She turned to leave, but her father's voice stopped her. Emily, wait. She froze, her breath catching. Just think about what you're doing, he said. His voice was calmer now, but not out of love, out of desperation. Emily slowly turned around. What do you mean? Her father shifted uncomfortably. You have an opportunity here. We could fix this. If you and Miles donate a little something to the family, we could put all of this behind us. Emily's stomach dropped. Ashley smirked from the couch. You could buy back your place in the family. Little sister. Emily's heart shattered. She had hoped, prayed, that this visit would mend something. But they didn't want her. They wanted her wealth. Beside her, Miles let out a cold laugh. So, let me get this straight, he said, his voice laced with disgust. You throw your daughter out. Call her a disgrace. Refuse to acknowledge your grandson, but now that she's married to a billionaire, she's worth something? Margaret flinched at his words. Miles shook his head. Unbelievable. Emily took a deep breath. She felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted. She looked at her parents, really looked at them, and saw them for what they were. Selfish, conditional, hollow. And then, she smiled. Not out of happiness, out of freedom. I don't need to buy my place in this family, she said quietly, because I already have one, with Miles, and with Noah. Ashley scoffed. So, that's it? You're just walking away? Emily turned, heading for the door. No, Ashley, she said, glancing back just once. I'm finally walking away from you. With that, she stepped outside into the cold. Miles wrapped an arm around her as she placed Noah in the car. As they drove away, Emily didn't look back. She had come seeking family. Instead, she had found closure. And that was enough.